one of our missional partners sent me a podcast called Maverick. Anybody listen to podcasts? If you go to like Spotify, I'm going to put a link to this, by the way, up this week. But if you go to like Spotify or something like that, you can download a podcast. If you're tech savvy like that, I listen to lots of podcasts. I don't listen to music. I like to listen to podcasts. Well, they sent me one called Maverick, and it's produced by their missions agency. And it tells the story of a man named Bashara. Now, that's a made-up name. That's not his actual name, because he is a Muslim, a former Muslim, living in Muslim Central Africa. His actual name and actual country and the actual details of the story there's other names that are used and other places that are used because if this information were to be found out online, he would be in even more trouble than he currently is. But it tells the story of a former Muslim, now a Christian as of a couple of years ago, named Bashara. And there's so many stories I want to tell you from the podcast so far, but I'm going to hold back. I'm only going to share one. I would encourage you to listen to it on your own time because it is straight up Acts. We've been studying the book of Acts in the New Testament, and Bashara's story reminds me of Paul's story. It's just amazing what's happening in his life right now and through his life. All that to say, when Bashara first became a Christian, he had very little experience with Jesus. He became a Christian because somebody teaching an English class just happened to hand out Bibles to the English students. Usually, it was just an attempt to. These were Christians who taught English classes. It was just an attempt to see if it would take root in somebody's life. They really couldn't teach Christianity in their English class, but they could at least hand out reading materials. Included was a Bible. Bashara started reading the Bible, was hooked, was drawn to Jesus, and just did what the New Testament told him to do and give his life to Jesus. He kept reading his Bible. One day, his wealthy and very devout Muslim family, his uncle specifically, discovered him secretly reading the Bible. And right then and there, he pulled Bashara out into the yard in front of the whole family. And on his right, he laid down a Bible, put Bashara on his knees, and on his left, he laid down a Quran. And he told Bashara, pick, choose. And then Bashara felt on the back of his head his uncle's pistol. This happened like 2 years ago. And Bashara, he'd been a Christian for all of 3 weeks, but had been soaked in the New Testament, soaked in the teachings of Jesus and Paul and all the other New Testament authors, and captivated by the crucified and risen King Jesus. Gun pressed against the back of his head. And he chose the Bible, and he hears a click. He hears the gun go off. No bullet hits his head. He hears a click again. No bullet hits his head. Now, if you like investigative journalism, this podcast dives into that a little bit, and they pull in a gun expert to try and explain what happened, and he had no answers. His scientific conclusion was not so scientific. He said it really had to have been a miracle. See, Bashara's uncle was in the military. I mean, he knew guns. His uncle was stumped. Couldn't figure out what happened. He wasn't going to embarrass himself and try a third time. And so instead what he did is he took all of Bashara's belongings. And this is a wealthy family. Bashara had a lot of stuff, clothes, possessions. He brought all his possessions out on the front lawn, and kind of as a symbolic act of kicking Bashara out of the family, doused it with gasoline and set it on fire in front of everybody. Bashara's out of the family. He's done. I won't tell any more of Bashara's story. You'll have to maybe listen to that on your own time. I will post the link on our Facebook page and group later on this week if you want to listen to more and give thanks to God for what he's doing in Bashara. I like to think that as Bashara was on his knees praying, not really knowing exactly what to do, being convicted that he needed to choose Christ, but not knowing exactly what he needed to do, I like to think that Jesus was standing right next to him. And I like to think that as that trigger was pulled, the creator of the universe and the savior of his people grabbed that bullet and stopped it from killing one of his servants right then and there. Because God had plans for Bashara. And there's a whole movement that is springing up even right now around Bashara. Being a witness for Jesus, in our context, is a cakewalk. It's a cakewalk compared to being a witness in Bashara's context, compared to being a witness in the Apostle Paul's context, which is what we'll talk about today, compared to being a follower of Jesus in many times and places throughout history, including places around the world today. And here's my conviction as we get into Acts and continue the story of Acts. And if these brothers and sisters can take a stand, then certainly we can. Then certainly we can. If they can bear witness, why can't we? Why can't we? The same King stands next to us. In Acts 22 and 23 today, we'll see Paul bravely, wisely, and humbly navigate pushback and persecution as he bears witness to Jesus. And he's able to do this, as we'll see, because the Lord stands near him. This year, as part of our vision and prayer to become a church for the community, we're asking God to grow us in missional and invitational neighboring. By that, we simply mean being open to relationships with all of our neighbors, the people God brings into our life. We mean being intentional and on Christ's mission toward the unbelieving and unchurched that God brings our way. It also means inviting the unbelieving to Jesus and the unchurched to Calvary or wherever your home church might be. Because what we're doing right now in Acts is we want to learn how to be compelling witnesses for Jesus, able to testify for him on a moment's notice, even in the face of suffering, like Bashara, like Paul in the book of Acts. Peter, one of Jesus' followers, wrote a similar encouragement to churches who were undergoing suffering, maybe the same kinds of suffering that Paul or Bashara would have been going through. Peter wrote this in 1 Peter 3. If you want to read this with me, you can. We're going to pick it up in verse 14, 15, and 16. You're welcome to read this along with me. I'd love for these words to just continue to been reading this for a few weeks now. I'd love for just our minds to be steeping in these exhortations. Peter writes, "If you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander." Compelling witness for Jesus requires speaking from the right identity, from the right community, with the right life, at the right time, with the right words, using the right emotions. It takes practice. It takes preparation. It takes study. It takes boldness and faith. And in Acts 20 through 28, Paul illustrates this very kind of witness that Peter's exhorting these churches to. Paul illustrates this with his own life in the midst of his own suffering, because he becomes a compelling witness for Jesus. Literally, Paul will be on trial for Jesus, basically throughout the rest of the book of Acts. And he will be a witness, so to speak, called to the witness stand, almost literally on occasions, to bear witness for Jesus. Last week in Acts 20 through 21, Paul was arrested by that angry mob. He was then detained by the Roman authorities. But he was still given a chance to speak miraculously. And in that intense moment, if you recall, Paul shared his testimony of God's grace in him and through him, how he had sinned by persecuting Jesus' churches, and how Jesus had confronted him and called him to a whole new kind of life. Paul talked about how he had surrendered to Jesus in faith and baptism for the forgiveness of sins, and how Jesus had then sent him for the rest of his life to bring good news to the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people all around the world. So we'll pick up our story there. Paul has just shared his testimony. The first part of our story is that the Roman commander fails to interrogate Paul. The Roman commander fails to interrogate Paul. Here we go. Verse 22 of chapter 22 in Acts. So the crowd listened to Paul until he said this, and this is how Jesus was sending him to the Gentiles. So the Jewish crowd does not like the fact that their God is calling Paul to minister to the Gentiles. So they listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live." As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust in the air, the commander, the Roman commander, ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. It was common in the ancient Roman Empire to use what we could call enhanced interrogation techniques, forcing confessions through flogging. Do you know what flogging is? Flogging is when your arms and your legs would be restrained. You might be laid out flat on the ground or on a table, or there might be a post, and your arms would be restrained, tied to the post, so that you couldn't defend yourself in any way. And then they would take a whip, a whip with many lashes on it, and embedded in each leather strip would be maybe pieces of metal or bone or anything sharp that they could get their hands on. And then against the body of the defenseless, stripped person who's tied down, they would take the flog and have at it. This would literally mutilate the human body. If you've ever read the Gospels, you know that this is what happened to Jesus before he went to the cross. Flogged by the Romans, they were trying to get him to confess crimes that he, of course, was totally innocent of. This is a horrific form of torture. Jesus endured it on his way to Calvary. And now Paul faces the same fate. A follower and preacher of the crucified Christ. Here's what happens. Verse 25. As they stretched Paul out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship, but I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. You see, Roman citizens had rights. They had the right to due process. You couldn't arrest or you couldn't flog, most definitely, a Roman citizen who hadn't been proved guilty yet. Non-citizens, non-Roman citizens did not have these rights. They were, you could say, guilty until proven innocent. Non-citizens could be arrested and flogged for whatever reason, which is why Pilate was able to do to Jesus what he did. Jesus was not a citizen of Rome. He could do whatever he wanted to Jesus, and he did. But in Paul's case, the Roman commander here would be breaking the law, putting his own command and maybe even life in jeopardy by flogging Paul. So to cover his own rear end, the commander puts a stop to the torture right away. Whoa, we got to figure out what's going on here. This man claims to be a Roman citizen. Now, it's important to realize here that Paul is revealing his Roman citizenship so that he might be protected by his rights, but he's not doing it just to avoid the suffering, because Paul has shown us on multiple occasions he's not afraid to suffer. Paul was stoned almost to death. They threw rocks at him in the city of Derbe. They almost killed him. Paul endured a beating in Philippi and imprisonment in Philippi. He endured suffering, persecution, never complained, only rejoiced, gave thanks to God that he had an opportunity to display Christ's glory even in the midst of his weakness and his suffering. So Paul is not pulling the citizen card here just to get out of suffering. He's doing it because he wants a chance to continue to bear witness to Jesus. When he reveals his citizenship, it's setting off a whole chain of events where he's protected by certain rights so that he can continue talking about Jesus. See, if he was flogged and beaten here, it might have been the end of Paul. The irony is that God is using Paul's providential birth as a Roman citizen to enable him to live and to witness another day. This is a surprising way for God to save Paul, using the broken Roman system, using the broken rights that Paul had, using them to preserve Paul for more witness. Verse 30, the story continues. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before the Sanhedrin, which brings us to the second part of the story. The Jewish leaders fail to indict Paul. The Jewish leaders fail to indict Paul. So the Roman commander says, this is a Jewish matter. We need to figure out, what is Paul guilty of? Why is this mob so angry? Let's bring him before the ruling council of the Jewish people, the Sanhedrin, which is made up of political leaders, religious leaders from all over the Jewish world. You think about it a little bit like a combination of our Congress and Supreme Court. It's kind of all that folded into one. And he's gonna ask them for a ruling on what's wrong with Paul. What's the deal here? Because he wants to make sure to get it right. Remember, his command and maybe even his own life is on the line here if he doesn't handle Paul correctly. So the Jewish leaders here will fail to indict Paul. Verse number 1 of 23. Paul, he's standing before the Sanhedrin, this Jewish council. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" And Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Did you catch this? Paul is on trial before the Sanhedrin. He says, my conscience is clear before God. He had already given his testimony. Many of the members of the Sanhedrin would have already heard his testimony from the previous chapter. And here Paul is saying, look, I don't know what else to say. Everything God has called me to, I've done it to the best of my conscience, to the best of my ability. And at that word, the high priest, who's a member of the Sanhedrin, Ananias, he can't stand to hear that kind of talk. He can't stand to hear this Jewish brother claim that he's obeying God, that his conscience is clear. So he orders one of his men to strike him on the mouth. Just gives, I don't know if that's a backhanded slap, maybe just a punch right in Paul's face. I don't know what it was like, but Paul, right after he's punched or slapped in the face, he curses the one who ordered that. He calls him a name, "You whitewashed wall," which is a name that one of the prophets of old in the Old Testament, Ezekiel, had used to describe the Jewish leaders, the leaders of Israel who were being hypocrites, called them whitewashed walls. But here's the thing, after Paul calls them a whitewashed wall and says, "God will strike you," one of the people standing by says to Paul, "You can't talk to the high priest of God like that." And what does Paul do? Paul, what does he say? Does he say, "That ain't my high priest"? It's like, he's not on my team. He did it first. What does Paul say? "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest." And then he quotes from the Old Testament, "Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people." Paul apologizes. Paul apologizes for insulting the person who had sinfully ordered him to be punched in the face. I know when I read this, I'm like, that can't possibly be what's going on here. Paul can't be apologizing. Paul can't be in the wrong here. Look at all the horrible things that are happening to him. And so we might think, well, the high priest deserved it. He's being a hypocrite. He himself is not following the law by treating a Jewish brother like this. We might think Paul doesn't need to apologize. The high priest should apologize. The high priest should definitely apologize. Absolutely. Now, whether or not, though, we think that Paul should apologize, here's the bottom line. Paul seems to think that he should. Paul is deeply concerned. I mean, just look at verse 1. He's deeply concerned about obeying God and having a clear conscience before God. He wants to do everything right. And he can't, as he knows from the law of Moses, he can't insult, speak evil of a ruler of God's people, even if he totally disagrees with them. Even if that leader is totally failing. Paul knows that Jesus taught, "Blessed are you when people persecute you, when people insult you." Paul knows that Jesus taught, "Turn the other cheek." See, Paul was convicted at that moment because he'd broken one of God's commandments in the law of Moses, and he was resolved to have a clear conscience before God and others. So he apologizes. The bottom line for Paul, though, is he doesn't want to spend all this time talking about himself. Paul wants to change the topic, and so he does. Verse 6. Then Paul, knowing that some of the members of the Sanhedrin were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When Paul said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. So Paul, really, is very crafty here, is able to divide the Sanhedrin, the group that's coming after him. He's able to pit them against each other by bringing up, really, ultimately, what's on his heart, the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Because on the Sanhedrin, just like we might have political parties in our day, and we have a Congress that's divided, half are this way, and the other half are this way. Paul, same thing on the Sanhedrin. You have about half are the Pharisees, and about the other half are the Sadducees. And they all have different beliefs. They have different theological beliefs. The Pharisees believed all of the Old Testament. And because they believed all the Old Testament, they saw very clear evidence for angels. They saw very clear evidence for the resurrection of the dead to come, that God would raise. There's promises all over the prophets that God would raise the dead one day. And so the Pharisees believed this very strongly. The Sadducees, on the other hand, believed in just the first 5 books of the Bible. They really put the law of Moses on a pedestal and kind of looked down on the other parts of the Old Testament. And so just by looking at the first 5 books of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, not a lot of evidence for the resurrection of the dead there. You could look at a few examples, but not a lot of evidence for that. So the Sadducees did not believe that there would be a resurrection. They basically believed that this life is all there is, and God has no plans to resurrect the dead someday. Now, Paul himself was trained, grew up as a Pharisee. In fact, Paul says, "I'm still a Pharisee." There's a sense in which Paul still embraces, there's a sense in which Paul sees Jesus as a fulfillment of Phariseeism. The Pharisees loved the Bible. They loved the devotion to God. They had it all twisted and wrong in their heads, and Jesus was set on straightening them out. That's why Jesus interacts with the Pharisees so much. Perhaps he agreed with them in a lot of ways. Just their hearts were broken, and they needed God to understand God's grace and their need for forgiveness. And so when Paul met the crucified Jesus, the Holy Spirit made it all click in his mind. And Paul says, "I'm a Pharisee." So Paul identifies with half the Sanhedrin, and then he explains that really what I'm on trial here for, gentlemen, is the hope of the resurrection of the dead, which sets him off. Now, the Pharisees, of course, didn't believe that Jesus was the first of many to rise from the dead. The Pharisees did not believe that. Paul did. The Pharisees did not. But Paul's not launching into that quite yet. The theme of Jesus' resurrection will be huge. I mean, it has been huge in Acts. It'll continue to be a key point as Paul bears witness before additional kings and governors and judges and authorities. But here, Paul just says, I'm on trial for the resurrection of the dead. So the controversy of resurrection splits the Sanhedrin in two. Here's how they respond. Here's how the Sanhedrin responds. Verse 9. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man, they said. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, a Roman citizen, torn to pieces by the Sanhedrin. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. So once Paul mentions the resurrection of the dead, the Pharisees are like, he's on our team. It's like any politician, right? The second they find something that reinforces their point, they're going to slide right over there. That's my team right there. Just a second ago, they'd wanted to stone Paul. They wanted to execute him, and now they're ready to side with him. But of course, that angers the Sadducees all the more. The two sides are so polarized that they can't decide what to do with Paul. So the Roman commander, Luke, the author of Acts here, explains, and Luke might have been watching this with his own two eyes. I don't know what this would have looked like. He says that Paul was almost torn apart by the Sanhedrin. And this is the respectable governing body of the Jewish people. And it's just a madhouse at this point. I don't know if you got like this. I'm just imagining this tug of war situation. You've got Paul in the middle like this, and you've got all the Pharisees just pulling him this way. You got all the Sadducees pulling him this way, and the Roman commander's like, stop. This is a Roman citizen. He's under my protection. He swoops in. He grabs Paul. First, he had to save him from the Jewish mob, and now he has to save him from the Jewish leaders. And he brings him into the barracks where he'll be safe, into the fortress. See, the irony here again is that whereas initially it was Paul's providential birth as a Roman citizen that God used to save him, now it's Paul's providential upbringing as a Pharisee that God will use to save him and help him to enable him to live and to witness another day. God has these surprising ways of saving Paul. Why? Why? In the story of Jesus, he did not survive this. Jesus was crushed between the hatred and the pride of the Jewish leaders and the broken and powerful system of Rome. Led Jesus to the cross. Why is God saving Paul now? You see, Jesus was killed and Paul is saved for the same reason. To rescue the world. Third part of our story. King Jesus succeeds in inspiring Paul. King Jesus succeeds in inspiring Paul. See, God has already used Paul's privilege as a citizen and upbringing as a Pharisee to spare his life for witness. But Paul is still in Roman custody. Paul doesn't know what's going to happen next. Rome doesn't know what to do with him. Jerusalem doesn't know what to do with him. As Paul goes into the barracks, right next to the temple in Jerusalem, what's waiting for him? What does tomorrow look like? Will he be released? Cleared of charges? Only to continue to be hunted by the Jewish leaders? Will he be executed? He's creating issues for Rome in Jerusalem. They can't have this Peace and quiet is what they want, or at least their style of peace and quiet. What awaits Paul? Will it just be more trials? I wonder what was going through Paul's mind that night. During what was perhaps one of the most anxious nights of Paul's life, God shows up. Verse 11. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." King Jesus, the exalted King of Kings, crucified and risen and reigning, has entered the dark, damp, despairing prison cell of his servant Paul. What do you need in the dark, damp, despairing place that you're at? What do you need when your loved one dies? You need the Lord to stand near. What do you need when you're going into that terrifying surgery? You need the Lord to stand near. When your partner or child or friend breaks your heart, the Lord stands near. When your uncle fires a gun at the back of your head because you believe in Jesus, the Lord stands near. Jesus shows up in Paul's prison cell and promises, "I've got you, Paul. I've always had you, and I'm going to carry you to Rome." He's all the way in Jerusalem. It's on the other side of the world to Paul. He's in prison. How's he going to get to Rome? He doesn't ask any questions. Jesus just promises, "I'm going to get you to Rome." If the King of Kings promised me that I would be his witness all the way to Rome, if I'm in Paul's shoes, my first thought would be like this: nothing can kill me. Nothing can stop me. I'm like, have you guys ever played Mario, the video game? Come on. You get that star, and you start blinking and flashing, and you can bulldoze through anything. Nothing can kill you. You just fly, right? You just go. I would feel so invincible. Nothing could kill me till I'm testifying to Jesus in Rome. That would be my first thought. My second thought is, oh boy, do I want to go to Rome? What happens in Rome? What's going to happen to me? See, Jesus promised to get Paul to Rome. I'm sure his mind is filling with questions. How will that happen? And what's going to happen when I'm there? If I were Paul, I'd be excited and yet at the same time afraid to go. Well, in the coming weeks, we'll see how exactly Jesus keeps this promise and how Paul responds throughout. And it is breathtaking. It's beautiful as we go. We'll look at that in the coming weeks. Let's wrap up with several lessons from this story. First of all, number one, apologize humbly. Apologize humbly. So for those of us who are Christians and witnesses for Jesus, wherever we're called, whether we're new to this, we've been doing this for decades, one of the things we need to embrace is the eagerness to apologize humbly, because apologizing for our own sin and keeping our conscience clear before God and others is vital for our witness. Now, Jesus himself, remember, remained silent before his persecutors. Paul was the one who cursed the high priest, said, "God strike you, you whitewashed wall." He cursed the high priest who had ordered him to be punched. Yet remember, Paul apologized for it as soon as he was confronted and perhaps convicted by the Spirit that he was not following the way of Jesus quite here by lashing back out at Ananias. You see, if we blow it, if we sin, we must own up to it, or else we'll destroy the credibility of our witness. Sinning or screwing up in itself does not destroy our credibility. It doesn't destroy the right life that backs up the gospel. Because when you sin, or even just a mistake, screw up, confessing or acknowledging that to whoever knows, to whoever's been hurt, that gives you an opportunity to talk about the good news of forgiveness. What destroys credibility is the insistence that when you sinned, you never did. That insistent, persistent denial of sin or even mistakes, the unwillingness to humble oneself, that destroys our credibility as followers and witnesses of Jesus. Sometimes we Christians are so confident that we're right about Jesus, and we are. The crucified and risen King Jesus. We're right about him. Sometimes we're so confident that we're right about him, though, that we think we're right about everything else, too. But being right about Jesus does not equate to always being right about everything else. Let me say that again. Being right about Jesus does not equate to always being right about everything else. We can sin. We can, of course, make mistakes. In fact, it's possible to sin against other people and against God even while we're standing up for Jesus. I think Paul did. I think Paul sinned when he cursed the high priest, and yet even he apologized. He immediately and humbly apologized for it. Placing his trust, I'm sure, in Jesus, knowing that Jesus had forgiven him. Don't hesitate to apologize for your mistakes and for your sin. We're not perfect, only Jesus is, and that's the point. That's actually an opportunity for witness, not the end of it. The second lesson is to speak wisely. Speak wisely. Like sharing your testimony, which we talked about last week, how we should be prepared to share what God has done for us and in us and through us through the years. And I did get a couple of you sent me your testimonies, by the way. I love reading those. Please send those in. I hope to share some of those here at some point this fall. Please send those. I am personally encouraged, and I'm grown in Christ when I hear your testimonies of God's grace. So please send those to me if you're writing those out and thinking those through, so that you're prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have. But as I said last week, sharing your testimony, it requires some thought. It requires preparation and being ready to share, so that in a moment's notice or at a time of suffering, you might be able to do so. But there's another skill we can develop as well, and that's just speaking wisely into the different situations that pop up around us. Speaking wisely and taking advantage of opportunities or resources that we have to point others to Christ. And that takes preparation too. It requires studying other people, the people in your life, or even just studying the world at large around you. For example, Paul understood his rights as a Roman citizen. And he didn't throw those away. He waited to use them. I mean, he could have pulled that out at any point in the book of Acts. In fact, I was thinking in Philippi, he was beaten and tossed into the Roman jail. Why didn't he talk about his citizenship then? He totally could have pulled the citizen card out and been like, I'm a citizen, you can't do that to me. He didn't. I'm not quite sure why he didn't. It wasn't in God's plan. But he did it in Jerusalem. Paul understood his rights, and he took advantage of them for the sake of the gospel. Paul understood the theological differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and then wisely used them to create some chaos and to give himself another chance to live and witness another day. Those were savvy moves on Paul's part. Jesus encouraged all of his disciples, in fact, in Matthew 10:16, to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. If that doesn't capture that, the dual responsibility we have to apologize humbly and speak wisely, I don't know what does. As wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. Wise and innocent. You see, we can be creative and smart in sharing Christ with others. And at the same time, do it with the right heart and in the right way. We can do that. We can creatively use our resources, our connections, our education, our expertise, our privileges to create opportunities to share Jesus. And we should, just like Paul was here. Let me just give you a little example of my own life as I try to figure out how to do this. Earlier this year, I volunteered to help coach a running club for young boys, upper elementary boys at my boys' school, where we focus on not just running and healthy living, but like healthy life choices. And so it's pretty general topics that we cover with the boys. But in just a few months' time, I've had many opportunities to build relationships with the boys, of course, and their parents and other coaches that I've come into contact with. And here's my prayer. My prayer is that God would give me wisdom to, first of all, just be a great coach. I just want to be a great coach in these boys' lives. A good communicator with their parents, supportive of what they're doing, a good teammate with the other coaches. But the other side of my prayer is that I want him to give me wisdom to take advantage of opportunities to point them to Christ. I've already had parents asking about my work as a pastor and about my church. We had some parents volunteer to be substitute coaches a couple weeks ago, and he had heard that I was a pastor, and so he was asking me, like, what denomination the church is part of, and he was asking all these questions. I'm like, I am so sorry. I really wish I could talk to you right now, but for like these 90 minutes, I need to focus on the boys. So I felt really bad because I really wanted to just drop everything and talk to him about it more. We'll hopefully have a chance to follow up. Trying to walk that line of being a good coach, but taking advantage of all those opportunities to share Christ. Because I want to respect the boundaries that when the parents signed their boys up, they weren't signing their boys to be up in Pastor Keith's Bible study. Okay? They were signing them up to be a part of this Healthy Choices curriculum where we're learning how to run a 5K. That's what they were signing them up for. And we're signing them up to be preached at. And at the same time, I don't want to lose my privilege. I have this privilege to be their coach. I don't want to be fired for crossing that boundary. So I'm having to walk that line. The fact of the matter is, though, Jesus is a big part of my life, the biggest part of my life. He has, over time, been controlling more and more of it. And I only hope to give him more and more control. In fact, Jesus is the reason I'd be willing to coach and give my time in that way in the first place. So I'm trying to be both wise and innocent in how I go about it. If you think about it, pray for Pastor Coach Keith as I try to figure out how to do that well and build relationships and share Christ with them. Wise as serpents, innocent as doves. Third lesson is take courage. Take courage. I hesitate sometimes to talk too much about persecution in our context because we have it so easy in our time and place. I know many Christians feel like Christianity is under attack, and it's like we face all this persecution. The fact is we don't, not relatively speaking. We do not. The fact is Christianity has always been under attack. 2,000 years of Satan. He went after Jesus first, couldn't be him. Been trying to take out his followers and his people ever since. Always been under attack. Our moment has actually been the exception. Praise God for the incredible freedoms and privileges we have, even as we follow Jesus in this broken world that hates Jesus. Christians have enjoyed a season of relative peace and acceptance over the past couple centuries in the West. It's just unprecedented in the acceptance of Christianity. But I do think it's important to talk about persecution in our context for two reasons. Number one, in our cultural moment, there is a kind of persecution we will face right here, right now. I'll just call it social rejection. So if you're a believer, there's a very good chance that at some point, if you haven't already, you'll face some sort of social rejection, ostracization, marginalization from other people. And it might be as simple as this. Somebody might make light of your faith. They might kind of just be dismissive about your faith and kind of laugh it off, make fun of it, maybe push you away. Let me give you just a simple example. Last Wednesday, we had almost 1,000 people in this building from Fruitport High School. The staff and students came over here for their emergency evacuation drill, and they crammed into every nook and cranny and did a great job. They did an awesome job with the drill, and the building was spotless when they left. I mean, they were very respectful, and it was wonderful. They did a great job. I was greeting the students as they came in, and then as they came out, just there to say hi. And as they were leaving, one of the high schoolers turned around just as he was exiting the main doors. He turned around, and he just waved, and he said, "Bye, Jesus." And then he turned to a friend, and he said, "Some people really need that." I chuckled at first. I just thought it was kind of funny, like his conception of whatever Jesus is, and like the idea that Jesus was like in here but not out there. Like, Jesus is following you the whole way back to the building. Just so you know, he's still there. You know, actually saying, the fact of the matter is, I think he was making fun of us. I think he was making fun of Christianity. I think he was kind of belittling it. Perhaps he'd been doing it the whole time he was in our building, the whole time we were showing hospitality and allowing them to use the building, which is hard to like to do. I wish I'd been a little more prepared for that moment here. I was talking about preparation last week. I wish I would have turned to him and said, "I need him." I'm one of those people that really need him. I wish I would have said that. I didn't. I just said, "Bye, have a good day." Honestly, I wasn't offended. Part of me bristled and was a little offended that he thought it was this weird, superstitious thing. But really, I was just sad. Sad that was this young man's conception of Christ, the crucified and risen King Jesus, who loves him deeply. We might face those little comments. Maybe a family member, a friend, a neighbor, coworker, classmate, maybe on social media, something like that. We might face those comments, belittling. Don't lash back. Don't defend yourself. Jesus didn't. Just love. Share Christ. Take advantage of those moments if you can. The other reason I think it's important for us to talk about persecution is because in the future it could certainly increase. Over time, Christians might be facing increasing marginalization, making it harder and harder on those of us who follow Jesus. We'll stick with him to the bitter end. But generation after generation might face more pushback, more persecution. We don't know. And it would probably be a slow process, like it wouldn't jump straight to mob violence in Jesus' case or Paul's case or Bashar's case. But it could start out in smaller ways, like, for example, the government could end the very significant and meaningful tax breaks that churches get. That would make it very difficult to operate a building on property, be very challenging. Sales tax breaks we get, it would make ministry, life together as we know it, a lot more difficult. It would be a lot more expensive. Things would probably have to change. That could be something that gets pulled at some point. It could be that certain ideas are censored online. There could be penalties or repercussions for preaching or teaching certain concepts that don't jive with what the broken world believes. Whatever the Lord has in store for us, here's my point. He stands near. He stands near us. Whatever's to come. He promised. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. That's what he said to all of us. So if you're a believer, trust that promise and live and witness like you believe it. He is right there next to you. the King of Kings. And if you're not a believer, but God is compelling you to follow his son, like maybe you've been tracking with us for a while, or maybe this is your first random time here with us, maybe online, I just would have you know it's not random. God brought you here. Follow this king, even in spite of all that it might cost you and cost us. You could pray something like this, and we'll close with this. King Jesus, I want to serve you. I know you'll take me, broken and sinful that I am. Please forgive me. Please restore me. Comfort me with your grace, and give me the courage to face my sin and the courage to follow you, even when it's hard. Amen.